All right, 2 countries down, 1 more to go. I'd like to introduce you to Carly Wunderlich. She works here at Michigan State University. She's one of the best debaters I ever coached, national champion in fact, and she will answer all of your questions about Venezuela. Carly Wunderlich, ladies and gentlemen.
Okay. All right. How to be successful while you're listening to my lecture. You should be taking notes. You should be thinking of questions that you want to ask me. And if you're too embarrassed to kind of ask in front of the group or you think of it later, you should be writing down and thinking about questions to ask your lab leaders when you get back to lab later today. Also, inevitably, when you find yourselves wandering around the internet, trolling around looking for something to do, you can like the Spartan Debate Institutes on Facebook. We put pictures up there as the camp goes on. And you can follow MSU Debate on Twitter so that we can be sure to tag you and you can see all the stuff that gets put up over the course of the next couple weeks. All right, let's talk about Venezuela. It was originally a Spanish colony. I'm going to go through some of the early history stuff fairly quickly, but it's just important to know a little bit about the background as you look forward on the rest of the topic, because being a colony is important to the overall sort of direction of the topic, because the country of Venezuela takes its independence very seriously, as you know the United States does, the same way that you celebrate the 4th of July and other things. Venezuela sort of declared its own independence from Spain in 1811. It was one of the first colonies to declare independence from Spain, and it wasn't successful until almost a decade later. Their official independence was granted in 1821, and the name at the time was Gran Colombia Bolivar, and the name kind of comes from a guy named Bolivar who was kind of part of helping out the revolution and the fight against the Spanish. After that, an era of political turmoil and military dictatorship sort of came about as they declared their independence from Spain, and that was the state of affairs in Venezuela for many, many years. There would be a military dictatorship that would be overthrown by another military. They would instill a military dictatorship. That would be the case for many years, and it sort of continued that way for a while. In 1958, democratic government began in Venezuela. That sort of meant that they had elections to elect somebody, but it's not, you don't necessarily need to think of democracy in Venezuela the same way that you think of democracy in the US. There are some things that are different that you'll realize as I kind of talk a little bit more about Venezuela. In the 1980s, Venezuela had a massive oil glut and they had a debt crisis, rampant inflation. As we go through the lecture today and as you learn a little bit more about Venezuela, a lot of their fate rests on oil. The same way that you think of an oil-producing country like Saudi Arabia being very dependent on things like oil prices, that's even more the case with a country like Venezuela. Because the government runs a lot of the programs there, they use the revenue that they get from oil in order to pay for a lot of those things. So when they run out of money from oil, they run out of money for social spending. And when they have a lot of money from oil, they have a lot of money for social spending. And so when things are good, they're really good, but when things are bad, they're really bad in a place like Venezuela, because they're very dependent on receiving revenue from oil. In 1989, there was the Caracazo riots. Hundreds, if not thousands, of people died. And they sort of rebelled against the president at the time, who was Perez, and created a bunch of political instability because they didn't have very much money. There was a lot of poverty, and they were sort of wanting a change in the government in 1989. And that sort of continued. That political instability really continued over the next few years and shaped a lot of what would happen for the next, 30 years after that. In 1992, a guy named Hugo Chavez, who many of you know because he was kind of the guy in Venezuela for a really long time, attempted a coup on the government. He was a member of the military, and he got a bunch of other friends in the military together and had control of about 10% of the military, and then attempted to overthrow President Perez. He, at that time, was unsuccessful in doing so because in the pre-Twitter, Tumblr era, it was really difficult to communicate with other entities within the military, and based on just literally communication failures, the coup was unsuccessful. Now, in what I think is one of the greatest political ploys of all times, Hugo Chavez, as soon as he realized that he was beat, which was fairly early on in the coup, approached President Chavez, and he said, all right, I'll surrender. All right, you got me beat this time, but I want to surrender right, okay? Can I give just a short video interview where I surrender, tell the people to put down their arms, and allow there to be political stability in the region? And President Perez basically fell right into this trap. He was thinking, great, we'll have this guy come on, tell everybody to put down their weapons, and we'll have less violence as the coup sort of dissipates. The miscalculation on President Perez's, the mistake that President Perez made there was that Hugo Chavez is a very charismatic character. And we'll talk about that a lot kind of in the, as this goes on, and you'll realize that as you research this. He was a guy who really excelled when he was put in front of a group of people, and he just had a way of connecting with the people of Venezuela in a way that many other political leaders have been unsuccessful at doing in Venezuela. So President Perez says, sure, Hugo Chavez, you can have a minute, 2 minutes, go ahead, state your case, tell the people to put down their arms and let the coup sort of dissipate. And that was sort of only successful for a while because people were still very mad at President Perez, and he was impeached only a year later. At that time, Hugo Chavez was still imprisoned because when the coup was unsuccessful, President Perez arrested Hugo Chavez and imprisoned him. But I just want to play you a clip of that discussion, or the surrender of Hugo Chavez, so you can see.
Y en la Brigada Militar de Valencia. Compañeros, lamentablemente, por ahora, los objetivos que nos planteamos no fueron logrados.
Sorry, what's the issue?
Can't really see.
Right, dim the light a little bit.
One more light right there.
Oh gosh.
There we go. There it is.
Can we just turn on the other light? Because I have a bunch of, turn on the back ones. All right, it's all or nothing. Great.
La ciudad capital. Es decir, nosotros acá en Caracas no logramos controlar el poder. Ustedes lo hicieron muy bien por allá, pero ya es tiempo de evitar más derramamiento de sangre.
Okay, that whole thing was sort of a fail because when it showed up, you can turn it back on for now. Okay, when I played it on my computer, it has subtitles, but the gist of it, all right, hang on. The gist of it is that when he surrenders, he says our goals have not been reached for now. Okay, so he says to the people, for now, we were unsuccessful in our coup attempt over President Perez. And when people sort of watched this on TV, they read between the lines and they said, our day will come. There will come a day when Hugo Chavez comes back and saves the people from all of the things that they sort of didn't like that President Perez was doing. And so there's a very important part of his speech where he says, por ahora, which I don't really speak Spanish, and that means for now, okay? So for now, we were unsuccessful in our attempts to overthrow the government. But I'll be back with sort of the between the lines message that Chavez left for the people. All right, now I want to just take a second before we get too far into Hugo Chavez to talk about where is Venezuela? Because if you get too far into the year and you kind of don't have that understanding of it, then you're going to have sort of some embarrassing moments that come up. Venezuela, located on the northern part of South America. It's actually fairly close to the United States. It's like a 5-hour flight from Miami, or a 4-hour flight from Miami. And it's, geographically very close to the United States. It has 3 distinct areas that are all controlled by the government of Venezuela. There are 23 states. There's a thing called the Capital District, which is sort of like Washington, D.C., which is where Caracas is, the capital of Venezuela. And then a group of islands that you can kind of see on the northernmost part of this called the Federal Dependencies. And population in Venezuela is very, very centralized within the northern part of the country and within the cities. It's a very, very urban country. This picture you can kind of see is a picture from outside Caracas looking in, and you can see there's the city center, and then there's just houses everywhere. There's people all clamoring to be right around the city center of Caracas. And so when you think about how do these things happen in Venezuela, why do people protest, how do these protests sort of take place, think about how urban it is, how easy it is to start something like a revolution or a protest or something like that in a country where everything is very urban. You're located very close to the other people that are kind of a part or a player in a lot of these things that kind of come up over the course of the history. And so when Chavez attempts a coup, he only has kind of a small area to sort of try to take over at the time. And that's true in the future. When people attempt to overthrow Hugo Chavez, think about how urban it is and how that affects a lot of the different things that are going on in Venezuela. Okay, so Hugo Chavez. He's democratically elected in 1998, and he wins 56% of the vote, which sounds like only 6% more than would be necessary, but it's not exactly a two-party system. So he actually won the election by 16%, which is like a pretty wide margin if you think about like how much Obama won the last election or how much U.S. elections are won by. And he won the vote by 16%. And by Inauguration Day, he had an approval rating of 90%. Okay, so just think about if President Obama had a 90% approval rating, the kind of things that he would sort of be able to do when he sort of took office. And when he came to power in 1998, Venezuelans were very, very dissatisfied with the previous government. They had removed Perez from office, they had had a lot of political instability, and then they sort of elect Hugo Chavez, who's this leader of the revolution and who had gone to jail. He was sort of a martyr figure for the revolution, and people were very enthused that the Hugo Chavez regime would be a huge change from the things that they had sort of been dissatisfied with in the past. Yeah?
Does it matter who the president was between when Perez was impeached and when Chavez was elected?
I think I have that written down somewhere just so I don't mess up his name. It starts with a C. It's like Cabrera or something. I don't remember off the top of my head. It's like Cabrera or something like that. But that person actually released Hugo Chavez from jail, which was sort of like his bad, because then Hugo Chavez won in the next election. So people are dissatisfied. They think Hugo Chavez is going to be the person to sort of save them and remedy all the problems of Venezuela. At the time, they felt like the government was very corrupt, that they took a lot of the oil revenue and spent it on sort of their government cronies and not enough on public spending and on the people because the poverty level was really very high. As soon as Chavez sort of came to power, he brought with him all of these reforms that he wanted to make on the government. And in 1999, Venezuela adopted a new constitution. And there were sort of three things that constitution had that was a major difference from the past constitution. The first was that it instituted some social programs to try to assuage all of the concerns that the Venezuelan public had about poverty and living conditions and that kind of thing. They instilled a bunch of social programs. They wanted more states benefits, more environmental protection, more human rights, all of that kind of stuff. The second thing that they did in the 1999 Constitution was affected presidential power. They changed the presidential term to be 6 years, and you were allowed to serve 2 terms. So theoretically, a president in Venezuela would serve for 12 years, or 2 terms of 6 years. They also consolidated some of the presidential powers over the military. So Hugo Chavez was allowed to control more of the military operations than previous presidents. And that partly had to do with the fact that when he was in the military, he had sort of attempted to overthrow the government, and he thought that the president needed to have more control over the military in order to stop people from overthrowing him in the future. The last thing was that they changed the Congress into one national assembly. They don't have a bicameral legislature like the US has, you know, the Senate and the House. They have one body of Congress called the National Assembly. And that was sort of another ploy by Hugo Chavez to consolidate more power for himself. If there are fewer legislatures or less power within the legislature, then it's easier for him to do things in the future to consolidate even more presidential power. His theory was sort of like, you know, I only have to convince this single body of government to agree with me in order to do the things that I kind of want to do. In general, the movement of the 1999 Venezuelan constitution shift moved a little bit away from sort of like free market ideas and capitalism, and a little bit more to like centralization, socialism, central executive control, things like that. And so Hugo Chavez sort of sold that to the people by saying, you know, the government should provide these social services to you. It shouldn't be left to the free market because it had been unsuccessful in the past with people like President Perez. In 1999, a bunch of natural disasters hit Venezuela, and Chavez's plate sort of just got overfilled, and there was a lot of death. Tens of thousands of people died. Whole towns were washed out to sea in Venezuela, and Hugo Chavez just sort of had a lot of things going on at the time and dropped the ball a little bit on like helping people in their different in their time of need, and it sort of started this like political dissent from people in the region, and it really made the local populations distrust Chavez, or at least start to think like maybe this isn't exactly what we were signing up for, because he was pretty busy consolidating his own executive power and not spending sort of enough time helping the people who were affected by the flood at the time. The United States offered aid to Venezuela at this time and was denied by Hugo Chavez. He thought, if I accept this aid from the US, I'm going to look weak to my people. And it sort of started this whole cat and mouse game between the US and Venezuela about whether or not we would assist, or whether or not the United States would assist Venezuela when things sort of came up in the future. And the reason that it's sort of worth mentioning is just that it really set the tone for the Chavez administration. He was very insistent that he maintain independence from foreign nations and stop their meddling. And he also sort of displayed an inability to follow through on social programs and promises that he had made to the people when times were really tough. All right, starting about 2002, things get really crazy between like the United States and Venezuela and some other stuff that was going on in the region. In 2002, there was a military coup attempt against Hugo Chavez. It basically all escalated because Hugo Chavez criticized the executives of the state-owned oil company on TV. He did a lot of live televised talks, chats, that kind of thing, and I'll play some of those in a little bit. But he basically got onto live TV and fired a bunch of the people from the oil company as he read their names on live TV. And it didn't play very well with the public, okay? Because they knew people who worked for the oil company. They take their oil very seriously. They sort of like that, the oil companies are successful. And Chavez just sort of went on TV and fired all these people. And there was a lot of blowback to Chavez at the time. 150 Venezuelans took to the street to rally against Hugo Chavez. He gets word of this as he's on TV reading off all of the names. And he attempts to essentially filibuster the ability to televise the protests that were in the street. And so Hugo Chavez stays on TV, and because of media controls and things like that, Venezuelan media was obligated to stay with the president, or President Chavez, as he sort of continued to talk, while these people are taking to the streets. And so TVs were showing Hugo Chavez and a split screen with all the people taking to the streets to protest against him. And he straight lies, okay? He just rolls, there are no protests. But people watching it on TV knew that he was lying because they could see on TV the live feeds of all of the people taking to the streets to protest. So the kind of phrase that came from a song, but the revolution will not be televised. Basically, it was Chavez's attempt to not televise the revolution. He was just going to stay on TV until all of those people went away. But he was sort of foiled by like split screen. So everybody basically figured out that he was a liar, and it really escalated tensions between him and the people of Venezuela at the time. Okay, so then the military steps in. They say, we're going to bomb the presidential palace unless you step down. So Chavez is in trouble here. And he reaches out to his friend Castro, who was in Cuba. Hopefully you all know that. And Chavez handed himself over and left for Cuba as a prisoner of the military. Okay, so now there's nobody in Cuba. No president of Cuba. The military is in control. And the U.S. is in a sticky situation, okay? The government had not really liked Castro up until this point, but had sort of accepted his presidency. At this point, he's a disposed president, and people in the U.S. media and the U.S. government start going on TV saying that they've disposed a dictator. Okay, and Chavez doesn't like that word, okay? He doesn't like to be called a dictator. He doesn't like for people to say that he was sort of illegitimate. And the U.S. and then, the U.S. media all start saying that Chavez basically got what he deserved, that he was overthrown in a military coup and that he was a military dictator, and that now they could have true democratic reforms. Okay, so just to foreshadow a bit, Chavez comes back later, and he's not all too pleased that while he was briefly disposed, the U.S. talked all this junk behind his back. Okay? Have you ever had a friend who sort of broke up with somebody, and then while they were broken up, you were like, oh yeah, that guy was a jerk, you should have never been dating him. And then they kind of get back together, and then that friend tells that other friend all of the things that you said about him while they were broken up? Okay? That's basically what happened with the U.S. and Venezuela. Okay, we talked all this junk about Chavez when he got disposed, and then he came back, and we sort of had egg on our face, because we were like, oh, by dictator, we meant democratically elected president? By got what you deserved, we sort of meant that you were just like taking a vacation. We just had to backtrack on all of this stuff that we had said about Chavez while he was gone. Like I said, eventually Chavez comes back, okay? The interim government really isn't able to consolidate power fast enough, and people sort of start to backlash against them. There's sort of this quote that was like they rejected the interim government of Carmona like a transplanted organ. So they sort of backlashed against them, and Chavez started to look pretty good. So they brought Hugo Chavez back, reinstated him, and basically it made the anti-Chavez opposition group look weak because they weren't able to consolidate power once they came to office. And everyone sort of, again, was reminded, hey, Chavez might be imperfect, but he's better than the alternative. He's able to consolidate power, he's able to organize the military, and it really started a point of national pride within Venezuela that they sort of liked Hugo Chavez, at least for a while. Okay, so things are going okay, but you'll remember that this whole thing started because Hugo Chavez went on TV and fired a bunch of oil executives. So the oil company, or the state-owned oil company in Venezuela, is still pretty mad at Hugo Chavez, okay? They're not exactly willing to forgive and forget and move on here. So they have a strike. Okay, what is the problem if the oil company strikes? No money, right? They ran out of money. So revenue dries up, and Hugo Chavez is sort of forced to take more drastic action. He sends the military into the bottling plants to sort of try to quell the the strike and forced people to work there. He ultimately fires almost 20,000 employees from the state-owned oil company. That's a lot of people. Venezuela has a population of like 500,000 people. So 20,000 people from the state-owned oil company. He sends in these military leaders, and he sends in this guy to the bottling plant. And this is sort of like a famous moment in Venezuelan history. The guy walks into the bottling plant that's shut down because of strike, takes a bunch of sips of soda from the bottling plant, and then like burps, okay? Like he doesn't even care, and it's on live TV. So people are watching this military takeover of the bottling plants, and the general or the guy in charge sort of is just laughing about it. He's like, the bottling plant is going to go back to operation. Hugo Chavez has got this under control, and then he burps. And they call it the burp that saved the revolution, okay, which sounds ridiculous. But basically, it allowed Chavez to consolidate his control over the oil company. He sent a signal that if you protested against Hugo Chavez and you worked for the oil company, he was not afraid to fire you. And then it was very important to him to control what the oil company was doing. And I mean, you all realize why that's true, because without oil, he has no money. And he's in seriously hot water if he has no money and no oil. All right, you all want to see the burp?
No, pues precisamente un allanamiento que se hizo en Valencia por parte del comandante de la producción de Carabobo, el general Luis Felipe José Javier, en la de Coca-Cola, pero eso dice que es banano con el Panamá, general, hoy se decía el caso de 48 horas que Libre le daba la empresa.
Okay, so if you're the average Venezuelan, you're watching this on TV, and it sort of convinced people that the plant owners and the people that were instituting the strike got what they deserved. They should be shut down. Chavez, by using his sort of like personality, charisma, people like this to sort of just get his message across, convinced the people that he was right, that the bottling companies and the oil companies would all do better under the umbrella of the government rather than to be allowed to do things like strike or stop production. Okay, so then there are still rumblings, okay, of people who are a little bit upset with Chavez. And there's a call for a recall referendum. And Chavez realizes he's in trouble, okay? He thinks he'll seriously lose in a recall election. And so he starts thinking, what can I possibly do to sort of quell the public opposition to my government? And he decides to start a bunch of social spending campaigns, okay? And I said before, remember, the thing that Chavez attempts to do to help the people is to spend all of the oil revenue that he has kind of on all these social spending ideas. And he starts these things that are called misiones, M-I-S-I-O-N-E-S, okay? It's like a Spanish word that I think means mission. And part of it is an attempt to beef up the healthcare and to reduce poverty, to do infrastructure development in the region, really convince people to stay in school, go to high school, go to college. It was like a scholarship fund. There was training for a bunch more agriculture and development of crops to help stop all of the starvation that was rampant in the region. And people really responded to that because they liked the idea that Hugo Chavez had their back and that he was willing to tackle all of these issues that were sort of going on in the region at the time. And he basically narrowly avoids being recalled, and then it sort of starts a cycle with Chavez where when he starts to get in trouble, he creates a bunch of social spending programs to spend a bunch of the oil revenue in order to sort of keep himself in power and stay kind of on the right side with all of the different citizens of Venezuela. All right, you already saw the burp. Okay, let's just take an aside to talk about Venezuelan oil in the timeline, because we sort of hinted that it was important, and we'll talk a little bit about the different things about oil fields and stuff. Venezuela is has the largest crude oil reserve in the world. Now, it's fair to be a bit skeptical of this reporting because it was reported by like Hugo Chavez, and there's like a self-reporting, but they do have a lot of oil. Okay, so who knows? It's the 4th largest supplier to the United States. Can anybody name the 3 people who supply more oil to the U.S.? Okay, Saudi Arabia, that's an easy one. Canada and Mexico, okay? Well, Venezuela, like one of these things is not quite like the other, okay? We have fairly okay relations with many of the other countries that we're sort of talking about. We import 800,000 barrels per day of Venezuelan oil. Venezuela sends the U.S. 43% of its oil. So we're basically frenemies with Venezuela because we don't have very good relations, but we sort of need them. Both countries talk a lot of junk behind each other's back, but we're mutually dependent on one another because of this oil. Venezuela needs the U.S. as a consumer of its oil because that's how they generate revenue, and the U.S. needs oil from Venezuela because because we're oil dependent. Like I said, in Venezuela, there's a state-owned oil company, and they nationalized the oil industry in 1976, and it's called the PDVSA. And it holds basically it controls basically all the oil in Venezuela. The issue is that before 1976, a bunch of Western companies drilled for oil in Venezuela and found it. And then sort of Venezuela realized that it was a bad idea to have their natural resource controlled by external actors and kicked all those people out, nationalized the oil company, and then consolidated control over time to the point where Hugo Chavez sort of, shut down the bottling plants and all the other stuff that we kind of talked about. So you might wonder why, if they only sell 43% of their oil to the U.S., can they not generate revenue at least from the other oil that they sell other places? Okay, they sell a lot of oil to Cuba, but it's sort of like a mutual assistance program. It's more of like a trade issue. Cuba doesn't pay the full price for their oil, and China pays down Venezuelan debt when they take oil. They don't give them cash. So despite having other places to go with their oil, the place that they go with their oil and then get top dollar and cash for it is the U.S. So it really truly is the U.S. creating revenue for Venezuela to spend on social programs and other things that they sort of are, infrastructure projects and things that they're doing in Venezuela. As you might imagine, there's still conflict between kind of the ruling regime and the state-owned oil company for a lot of the things I talked about. When it's nationalized and the government sort of tries to tell the PDVSA their business, there's a lot of executives and people who work there who sort of don't like the attempt to take control. But this will explain a lot of the different motivations that people have when we talk about affirmatives this year, because the interest of the oil company is not always perfectly harmonized with the interest of the president of Venezuela or the government of Venezuela. And so there's conflict between those things. And that's a little foreshadowing, and I'll talk about some AFs in a bit. But just think about, if you're a company in a country and that government tries to sort of tell you how to rule your or run your company, how that could potentially cause conflict down the line, and why, the best interest of one might not be in the best interest of the other. Yeah.
What would happen if, say, we found another big oil supplier and stopped buying oil from Venezuela?
Well, the reality is that most people have looked to see if they have oil or have some huge oil reserve, because oil is a hot commodity. If theoretically we could find like a magic oil reserve that wasn't Venezuela, they'd be in hot water because their revenue would dry up. But that's sort of like spitting wishes, because we haven't really been able to find that yet. Okay. Oh, sorry, yeah.
Doesn't China buy almost all of their oil from Venezuela?
Yeah, well, did anybody catch why I said that China's revenue didn't count as much? Yeah.
Because China's paying the money, like, they're giving them the money, but they're
Right. So when China buys oil from Venezuela, they pay down Venezuela's debt or buy up Venezuela's debt. It doesn't go into cash. Only when the U.S. buys, well, not only, but primarily the U.S. is the one who, when they buy oil, it goes into cash. Yeah.
Why does Cuba get a discounted rate? Like, what's the trade there?
It's sort of, okay, so part of it is that Hugo Chavez has a good relationship with a few other countries, and Cuba, or had, and now Maduro does, but Cuba is one of those countries. They're just a trading partner. They do a lot of like infrastructure in the region, a lot of like Latin American development and that kind of stuff. And they sort of have like a, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. Like, you give us some oil, we'll help you with this project. And they get everything at a discounted rate. And that sort of developed because Chavez and Castro were like biffles. Yeah, you.
Does the state oil company, since they're in conflict with the regime, do you think they have any chance of morphing into kind of a political entity and like conflicting with the regime?
Well, they certainly conflict with the regime in words. The issue is that they don't have like a military or a bunch of other stuff that you would need to really threaten the regime. The conflict more comes about when you attempt to sort of like, you know, like let's say like a U.S. oil company wants to work with them. That might be in the best interest of the oil company, but then it'll come in conflict with the ruling party because they'll be like, you can't do that, you're nationalized, don't work with the U.S. company. And so they sort of get into public fights and, you know, wars of words, but it's tough for the state oil company to really fight back because they don't have like a military or some other stuff. Yeah?
Do you think that if like the U.S. stopped being oil dependent would create human rights issues in Venezuela?
It certainly would cause political instability. It would, I mean, obviously this is speculation, but if the U.S. stopped buying their oil from Venezuela and some of those social programs dried up, I think there'd be political instability and unrest. And then it would sort of be the question, is there a coup and, you know, is a regime change successful, or is there even more crackdown and centralization from the government? And that could certainly create like a human rights concern there. Did you have a question?
Yeah, it's more just general. When Chavez got elected, so like, did he keep getting elected slowly for a while, or was he just like kind of staying out?
Okay, yeah, his question is, did he keep getting elected? Yeah, he kept running in elections and he would be reelected. And I'll talk a little bit about that when I do the Maduro election. But, okay, so you live in a country and they say publicly, our elections are free and fair, okay? But the reality when you're a citizen of that country often feels a lot different. Because all of the friends of Hugo Chavez are getting handouts. They're the ones benefiting from the social programs. They're the ones who live in the biggest houses and have the nicest things. And some of the people who are the most vocal opponents of Hugo Chavez are like disappearing. So despite it being free and fair publicly, and like, yes, everyone could vote and theoretically, you know, was allowed to, there definitely is some question about how, if you're so unpopular in some ways, can you be reelected? And the reality is, because when you have a lot of centralized power, it affords you a lot of different opportunities to try to influence people in a really heavy-handed way. Does that kind of make sense? Okay, yeah.
So I know that Venezuela has more oil than Saudi Arabia, but where does it stand production-wise, like, or extraction-wise?
I believe that they are pretty capable of extracting a lot of the oil, and they've definitely ramped up production. Like 800,000 barrels a day is a lot of oil, and that's half of it. So my understanding is that they're fairly equipped to extract the oil. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Here, I'll go to her first, and then you.
Two things. One, is it Chavez who, once he got into power, he like changed the law so that he can get elected half as many terms as long as they're consecutive?
Yep. So there is sort of a couple more referendums that come up under the Chavez regime that I'll talk about. But her question was, didn't he change it so that there were no term limits? And he ultimately was successful, so that theoretically there would be no term limits. You would serve 6-year terms but could run indefinitely. And I'll talk a bit about his attempt to do that in a second. But yeah, you're right.
And my second one was, with the Cuban oil app, would it benefit, like that one that we have here, like Cuba gets their own oil and they drill and stuff, would it help them drill? Would that benefit Venezuela because they're not getting keeping them a discounted
I think that if we attempted to more normalize relations with Cuba and help them do things like, create more domestic oil, that it would potentially break the relationship between Cuba and Venezuela. And for Venezuela, I think that would be bad. It would be sort of like hanging them out to dry when they really need regional partners in order to solidify their opposition to the U.S.
Would that be bad for U.S.-Venezuela relations then?
Well, it's tough to say they could get a lot worse because but yeah, it's potential that Venezuela would retaliate, but the reality is that they're pretty stuck selling their oil to us for all the reasons that we sort of talked about. Yeah.
You mentioned, both U.S. and Venezuela are interdependent on each other. Has there been any improvement in the relationship? Like someone, it sounds like they're like two little kids who just haven't figured out. You can't live like your brother and sister. You can't live without this person. Has there been any attempt to try to fix that relationship at all by them or any other outside entities?
So he asked, have they attempted to normalize relations a little bit more, realizing that they're mutually dependent? It varies a bit over the course of recent history. Under the Bush administration, there was really horrible relations with Venezuela, and there were really not very many overtures between the two countries. When President Obama took office, he sort of said, we're going to undergo a period of what he called constructive engagement with the region and with Chavez. And ultimately, that wasn't all that successful either. There basically just continues to be a series of miscommunications and weird things that cause us to continue to be antagonistic with them. And partly, they use opposition to the United States to consolidate their own power domestically. So, to sort of work with the United States would be a stamp of approval on some things like capitalism and democratic government that they don't necessarily have. And so what they gain from continuing to be antagonistic is an ability to centralize power within their population a little bit more. Those are good questions. Okay. We talked about that already. I sort of previewed what happens with the constitutional referendum attempts in 2007 and 2009. In 2007, Chavez proposes that they abolish term limits and reduce the power of mayors and state representatives, and kind of stop having federal dispersed state level control. That referendum fails, okay? And it failed for a lot of different reasons, but the bottom line is he didn't quite have kind of enough control consolidated at the time, and a bunch of people that had previously been part of the Chavez regime spoke out in order to encourage people to vote against the Chavez referendum. Those people were jailed, okay? So, referendum attempt number 1, closely defeated. People who speak out against it, jailed, okay? 2 years later, Chavez is like, hey, let's do those same things, basically. And if you're the person who opposed the first one but didn't get jailed, are you going to be the person who opposes the second one? No, okay? Most likely, you're kind of going to fall into line. And the second constitutional referendum passed with 55% approval. That is what we were talking about earlier, that abolished term limits for the president. So, theoretically, a president can be elected indefinitely for 6-year terms over the course of their life. In 2012, Chavez was elected for the last time. He ran against a guy named Governor Radonsky, who comes back later when Chavez dies. And he was worried that he was going to lose because when the economy went down globally, the oil prices suffer. You know what I mean? It's all a chain reaction. And he started to run out of revenue. And so he sort of just started to pay out favors to a bunch of different people to keep control consolidated within himself. And, it's, classic Chavez. He hands out power to handouts to a bunch of different people so that they'll kind of help him get reelected. But at the time, he was struggling with a lot of health issues. He had cancer, and from 2011 until 2013, he was very, very sick, and he died on March 5th of this year. At the time, his vice president, Nicolas Maduro, is named the interim president of Venezuela. And we'll come back to Maduro in a second. Well, we don't have to play the video. I'll put all of this on the pad site so you can watch the videos. But I don't know if you all followed this, but at the time there was a lot of international angst over what would happen when Hugo Chavez died. A lot of people were worried that the transition to Maduro would cause a lot of instability in the region. There was a lot of questions about what would really happen because power had been consolidated with Hugo Chavez for many, many years. And so the transition gave people a lot of anxiety internationally. A lot of other countries, the US included, were worried about what would happen when Hugo Chavez died. And so that clip sort of explains that, and you all are welcome to watch that later. But I just want to mention, like, when this happened, there was a huge question about whether or not political instability would escalate in the region. Yeah. I'm sorry, what? There was one recall election that he was successful in. Yeah, right. Okay, so I foreshadowed a lot about Chavez's political strategy. The media is pretty nationalized in Venezuela. If he gives like a press conference or a chat, they're required to cover it. He censors a lot of like print media and kind of limits the number of people that are allowed to come to the United States. And he would give these things called chains, which were just him talking. He was charismatic, I said that, but people just connected with what it was that he was saying when he was on live TV, and he would sort of go on and just chat with people, and he's really different than any other sort of leader that you would think of. He would just go on live TV and talk about issues that were coming up and what he sort of thought he might do to fix them. It was all really off the cuff. It was relaxed. He really got the people feeling like he was one of them and like he was on their side, and used that as a lot of political propaganda to do things in the region that he wanted. And so these videos are just sort of him chatting with the people on live TV for many, many hours. He had almost 2,000 of these chains or like nationalized, televised talks, and it would be 53 days of continuous coverage if you played it. So over the course of Chavez's time in power, he spent 53 days, if you strung them back to back, on TV talking with the people. And it was televised on every TV channel and every sort of, it would be covered by everyone in the media. And he hated George Bush. I'll skip this because I am running a little bit short on time, but it is sort of funny if you just YouTube things that he said about George W. Bush. But he would call him a donkey, he called him evil, he called him the devil. Like they were in like a serious like name calling back and forth. And he would just get on TV and sort of talk about how George Bush was trying to assassinate him, how he was, an incarnation of the devil, and create all of this and then he would use that to consolidate power within the government, within his own people there, and so that they would have kind of a common enemy to rally around Hugo Chavez.
So, did he basically use like fireside chats?
Yeah. But it was a lot more, he asked if he used fireside chats, but it was a lot more cash than like a President Obama fireside chat or something like that, because it would just show him like doing everyday things. He'd drive a tractor, he'd like help out with an infrastructure project. He was just like being a regular dude, and he got a lot of free press coverage from kind of doing all that stuff. Okay. All right, let's refocus because we're sort of getting into like the current stuff that is going on in Venezuela now. All of this really informs a lot of what's going on. I don't want you to feel like I wasted your time by telling all these stories about Hugo Chavez, because this really is a recent development, and a lot of it informs sort of the political landscape that's there now. Maduro is the president of Venezuela now. He was chosen, handpicked by Chavez to be the vice president, and he considers himself Chavez's son. And he says that Chavez visits him as a bird and tells him how to run the government. Okay, setting aside like the ridiculous anecdote component of that, he just continues to invoke the Chavez image in order to maintain his own credibility as the president of Venezuela. and essentially has attempted to just maintain sort of the status quo that Chavez had set up. He barely won the election against Radonsky. It was very, very close. And Radonsky challenged it, which is sort of, it was bold. Like, we'll see what happens to Radonsky and like where he goes over the next couple years. But he challenged the election and said that they should do a recount. And it created sort of some international question from other governments in the world about what the reaction to that should be. And for the most part, the U.S. just stayed out of it, okay? We were sort of like, hey, you handle your problems. Seems like the Maduro guy was elected. You know, you just kind of figure this out. Now, in a classic, like, miscommunication, Maduro thought that by saying nothing, the U.S. was not recognizing the Maduro government. In our mind, we're just like, hey, that guy's elected, let's move on. They thought that the United States needed to give a public declaration that officially recognized the Maduro government as the legitimate government of Venezuela. So Maduro is mad at the U.S. that we sort of were silent there, and we misunderstand and think that we did everything fine, and now he just hates us for no reason, which is like so silly when you think about like international problems, but it really was sort of all as a result of this super close election that the U.S. just essentially stayed out of. One more thing about Maduro is just that he has struggled because he's not as charismatic of a character as Chavez was. He was literally a bus driver who like ascended through the ranks of government as like a friend of Chavez, as a crony, and he doesn't have this he doesn't have the military background. He doesn't have the same allure to the public that Chavez did, and so he's struggled a bit as just kind of being the next heir to Chavez, but not really being prepared to fill all of the, to fill the shoes that Chavez left behind. I'll briefly mention a little bit of the status of relations between Venezuela and other countries in the region. I already talked about Cuba. They're pretty close. You know, all of this is in flux because there's a question of what Maduro is going to kind of do as they go forward. But definitely Cuba and Venezuela cooperate a lot. Colombia and Venezuela are also sort of frenemies, like they've gone back and forth a little bit, and there's just sort of there are a number of disputes with them over the years, but they also sort of cooperate with Colombia. One thing about Chavez and Venezuela is that they really try to do a lot of regional things in Latin America, and the reason is to try to consolidate a larger grouping of power that opposes someone like, the United States. And so they kind of try to get other countries together in the region. Cuba, always good for it. Colombia, on and off. China and Russia are involved, okay? We talked about China, how they buy a lot of oil from Venezuela. They also are more centralized, a little more socialist, a little less capitalist, and that jives very well with a lot of things that are kind of going on in Venezuela. And that allows them to have kind of cultural and scientific exchanges with China that go generally better than their exchanges with the U.S. Russia comes up because they supply Venezuela with arms. Okay, so when you think about other countries, this comes up with Iran sometimes. You know, Russia kind of helps them out, gives them some stuff for the military, and they do the same for Venezuela. They have joint military exercises. They loan Venezuela a lot of money. They give them really cheap weapons and sort of keep Venezuela powerful from a military perspective. Obviously, those things matter as you think about the topic because it's going to be difficult for the affirmative to explain why the United States should be the one to try to attempt to get Venezuela to make these changes because they have much better relations and exchanges with many other countries internationally. I've hinted at the relationship with the United States. The best way to sum it up is if they were in a Facebook relationship, it would be complicated, which is why I put like the little graphic up there. It really changes all the time. We're their number one trading partner, but they also don't really like us, but we both sort of need each other, and it's very complicated to work out a lot of different stuff with Venezuela. We give them democracy assistance, we give them small amounts of foreign assistance, but in reality, they really don't like us messing with what's going on there. Remember when I said that Chavez rejected U.S. aid after the flood in 1999? That set the tone for kind of how things are going to be. They don't want the U.S. meddling in domestic affairs. One example of this, we used to do a lot of drug cooperation with Venezuela, and in 2008 or 2005, they kicked out the DEA, which is the Drug Enforcement Administration, because they thought that we had put it there to spy on Venezuela. Now, in their defense, like we might have, okay, like we were probably like checking in on what they were doing, and so there's like constantly this thing, like yes, there are areas for mutual cooperation, but it's really difficult to move beyond that because of the distrust that's sort of underlying. Like maybe the DEA was there just trying to be nice, but maybe they were also kind of like spying. And so even the smallest stuff is really difficult to sort of use to kind of spill over into broader relations. I talked a little bit about why Maduro is mad at the U.S. now, right? Because we wouldn't or they thought we didn't recognize their government. And he just generally feels like the U.S. doesn't take his presidency seriously, when in reality, the U.S. is just kind of attempting to go on with business as usual. When he was elected, people thought that Maduro would be more moderate. But when you think about where we go from here, you know, if you're Maduro, you need to think about how to consolidate your own power and whether or not you need sort of like a common enemy. And the reality is that he's probably going to stay fairly extreme with regards to the United States, even after he's been in office for a little bit longer. Another thing to remember is that there's a huge difference between what people say publicly and kind of what they do behind closed doors. Okay, so publicly, Maduro has a lot of harsh things to say about Obama and the United States. You know, that we're spying on them, that we're attempting to assassinate, like their political leaders, like all this stuff. But the private overtures have been a little bit better, like a little bit better. But, you know, we've sort of created a little bit more harmony in trade and a little bit, you know, a few things like that to attempt to improve relations. And so there is a difference between public remarks and private overtures between the U.S. and Venezuela. But for the most part, it's just really, really complicated to try to cooperate with them over a lot of different things. Okay, I put on this Snowden asylum thing because it's really come up and blown up a lot in the last few days. Does everyone know who Snowden is? Yeah, okay, it would be hard not to. But Maduro and the government of Venezuela, right after all that stuff happened with Snowden in Russia, offered asylum to Snowden in Venezuela. And that hasn't exactly put them on like the US's like favorites list right this second. So again, I mean, there's like this conflict that comes up between the U.S. and Venezuela, you know, and it's difficult to remedy because there's just a lot of underlying tension. Yeah?
Do you think they accepted Snowden just to like stick it, or like just get angry, or?
It's tough to say. I mean, I just don't think that they prioritize, like, I don't think for Venezuela a top priority is making the U.S. happy. And so it's tough to know if they just did it because they didn't care or because they were trying to make us mad. But for the most part, it sort of helps Maduro if the U.S., if he can look reasonable and he can make the U.S. look like the U.S. is threatening him because of all the like public stuff that we talked about earlier. Yeah?
Was this topic, the just overall topic, before or after the Snowden events occurred?
The topic was selected before. Yeah, it's just like a coincidence, and I kind of put it on there because it seemed like it was going to come up over the next couple of weeks, and everyone knows who Snowden is. Okay, let's talk about Venezuela and the topic. I've tried to foreshadow a lot of this, okay? And if you just think about a lot of the stuff that we've said over the course of the last hour or so, you'll start to see some different things that could be potential affirmatives and what's going to come up for the negative. So there's a lot of ground as it relates to drug enforcement. Venezuela is sort of a hub of like drug influx to the United States. All of Latin America has kind of been a part of the U.S.'s attempt to curb the flow of drugs. And so there are definitely affirmatives about potentially, you know, bringing back the DEA or something like that to cooperate with them. much like the Cuba F or some of the different Cuba things that we've talked about, there's a lot going on with oil in Venezuela. We could, offer to help Venezuela develop oil fields. We could potentially help to assist liberalize the PDVSA. Now, we could recognize the Maduro government, which we talked a little bit about, although we don't think it's necessary. It would be very symbolically important to Venezuela. Or we could attempt sort of quid pro quo. Have you heard that word before? Yeah, okay, good. So, that we would give them assistance for, developing their oil fields if they would agree to curb corruption. Corruption is a huge problem because of all of what I've talked about. There's a lot of cronies that get handouts directly from the government. There's a lot of underground stuff kind of going on, and there's a lot of corruption. So, the U.S. might attempt to stop corruption or help, consolidate democracy or some of the other things within Venezuela as part of a quid pro quo. Now, who can see a problem with a lot of these affirmatives? Yeah, what behind Bernard? Yeah, sure. How is it economic? So yeah, obviously I agree that there are T questions as it relates to some of these things. It depends on sort of whether or not you think removing a barrier to economic engagement is topical. So if you recognize the Maduro government, it would facilitate a lot of economic engagement between the United States and Venezuela, but it's just a question of whether or not it has to be direct or whether or not you can remove a barrier to economic engagement. Okay, so who sees a problem with trying to do all this stuff with Venezuela? Yeah, what's the problem?
They hate us.
Yeah, right? We're not friends. Okay, we don't really get along with them. They could very well say no to a lot of the different overtures that we kind of make to them. Or they could say yes to our face and then not really do it behind and then not really follow through on a lot of things in the future. Like, oh, yeah, like we'll help you out with like drugs if you help us out with corruption, and then just like never institute the reforms that they had kind of said that they were going to do. And so there's a huge question about whether, implementation and whether or not these things will actually sort of work. And that's sort of why I think generally Venezuela might be a little bit less popular of a choice. It's in flux because Maduro just came to power and nobody really knows what's going on with him. And it's really unclear whether or not Venezuela wants to do any of this stuff with us. And so when you're thinking about just negative, you debated Venezuela app and you've never debated it before. Just think about what the motivation of the government would be to accept whatever the affirmative is that they say would be economic engagement. The other issue as it relates to say no is how the government would respond versus how the people would respond versus how like the oil company would respond, okay? It's possible that we would offer to do something or, create some sort of economic engagement that the public would really like or that the oil company would really like, but that the government feels like they can't accept. Or alternatively, if we crafted some policy that the government really liked, it might be unpopular with the public or unpopular with the oil company. And all of these things are really important, for all of the different intersecting issues that we had kind of already discussed. So when you're negative, there's a few different things that might come up, and I'm sure that, you'll talk more about this. Like I said, say no is a huge component of it. Would it be popular or unpopular in the US if President Obama spent a bunch of money doing stuff with Venezuela? Unpopular, probably, right? Like we don't have like a whole lot of extra money these days. We're really not that good of friends with Venezuela. And to do something like economic engagement or development with them could potentially be, cause backlash against President Obama. I think there's probably, there is obviously a link to the politics to said. Is there, okay, so like I said before too, under the Bush administration, things were horrible. Generally, the Republicans and the GOP don't like engagement with countries like Venezuela. So if Obama attempted to do something with Venezuela, it would probably make some of those constituents upset as well. Just people who think that we need a hard line against military, dictators and sort of, dictators, which they think he is. All right. There are domestic implications in Venezuela if we did something like economic engagement. it could, okay, let's say the U.S. does this huge plan with Venezuela and helps the Maduro government. Maduro might look weak to the people in Venezuela. Okay, it might look like he can't control the government the way that Chavez did by himself without soliciting extra money from the U.S. to do a bunch of reforms. And that would be something like a domestic politics to set. If the public backlashed against Maduro as a result of the U.S. sort of doing economic engagement with Maduro in the region. Does that make sense? There would be implications either way. You know, on the other hand, it could be popular with them and help Maduro and their, you know, but it goes both ways. But think about the domestic implications of doing it as well as the implication, or domestic as in domestic in Venezuela, as well as things like in the United States and how that would play politically. Condition/don't condition is a huge part of sort of, I'm sure what you'll talk about over the next couple weeks here. But if you did a quid pro quo, okay, we'll give you money to stop corruption if you help us with drugs, you could potentially have a counter plan to be like, we'll help you with drugs or help you with corruption, but then not condition it on anything. Because governments like Maduro, who are skeptical of foreign intervention, generally don't like when the U.S. sort of attempts to manipulate their government by conditioning aid. So a counter plan that gave the aid unconditionally might get a little bit farther in Venezuela. There's also sort of like if the AF didn't condition, the counter plan could condition. But again, that'll get delved into a lot more over the next couple weeks. But it's a huge issue as it relates to Venezuela because we have so little cooperation with them now that it almost certainly in real life, if we attempted to do economic engagement, would be as part of a trade, as part of a quid pro quo or a broader deal with Venezuela. It would be very unlikely that President Obama tomorrow would announce an economic engagement plan with Venezuela because we just don't have that good of relations with them and it's not sort of like a top priority. So in the real world, most likely there would be some give and take as it relates to Venezuela. Okay. I'm sure that you all have talked about like advantage areas and that kind of stuff. Obviously, there's a huge question about how the AF would affect oil, and there are advantages or disadvantages as it relates to oil. U.S. soft power is the question, like whether or not it would look good or bad for the U.S. to sort of engage a regime like Maduro's, and whether or not that would help our international image. Whether or not we could parlay that engagement into doing things with other countries in the future, or just generally creating relations on a broader spectrum of things in the region, like Latin American relations. The other thing that I sort of hinted at, all of that stuff that's going on with China and Russia is relevant to debates about Venezuela because it raises the question, should they be the ones to engage with Venezuela? Or if the U.S. undertook a huge engagement policy with Venezuela, how would China and Russia react to something like that? If you're China and you receive a bunch of your oil from Venezuela, you would potentially fear an expansion of relations between the United States and Venezuela. Because if they started to sell us more oil at a discounted rate or something like that, if you were China, you might worry about whether or not your supply of oil was going to get cut off from Venezuela. So there are all these questions about people's sphere of influence, who controls what in Venezuela, and sort of who influences the Maduro government. Okay, so that's kind of what I've got. We do this thing with Casey, who's like the director here. When he's done with something, he goes, ta-da, and makes the face that's on the board. So I'm done. But does anybody have any questions about stuff?
The domestic politics data, would you run the same way that normal politics data would, or?
Well, it could be issue specific, right? You could have like a specific thing that Maduro wanted to do that he needed support for and like have an impact as it relates to that. Or it could be general, right? Like Maduro needs to have public support to quell instability and debated about it like that. But it is very similar to domestic politics to that. All right, hang on. Let's stay quiet and be respectful of these people's questions. You still have plenty of time to go upstairs for lunch. Yeah. Hang on, I can't hear him because everyone's like shuffling around. So, what's your question? Does Venezuela have with Mexico? In not all that much, to be honest, because it's mostly like Mexico is kind of hanging out with the U.S. and Venezuela is sort of hanging out with other Latin American countries. Certainly, it's come up where there's been sort of attempts to do things, but they're not. There's sort of like this other grouping of people of like Cuba, Colombia, Venezuela, who have more like Latin American attempts, or more attempts in Latin America to do infrastructure, and Mexico is not always included in that. Yeah.
What's the status of current Venezuelan diversification?
What's the status of Venezuela's diversification of its natural resources and its economy? Poor. Okay. The contingency plan for Venezuela when it runs out of oil is not in place. Have you all ever heard the term Dutch disease? Okay, it's kind of like that, where Venezuela gets super dependent on its oil and then doesn't really attempt to develop other sorts of resources. And Venezuela is definitely in trouble when they run out of oil. Yeah?
Venezuela's biggest ally, best friend.
Who's Venezuela's biggest ally? They're really good friends with Cuba, they're really good friends with Iran, and then China and Russia are sort of helping them out with money and military stuff. All right, if you all have any other questions.
Hang on 1 second, everyone.
Oh.
Tonight, at the SDI, every night, we have something that's called After Lab. It's for any student in any session. It's always optional. It'll start a little bit after 10 o'clock. It's on the 3rd floor. Tonight, I'll give the After Lab. It's a discussion chosen by the students. I'll let you know the topic of the discussion later on. You're welcome to attend. Again, it's in the dorm, so you have to stay in the dorm. Guys have to use the elevators because the dorm on the 3rd floor is a girls' room. And you're all welcome to attend. It's a great way to interact with other students from all the sessions. If you have questions for me or for Carly, come forth and ask them individually. Otherwise, enjoy the lovely cafeteria. Sorry, guys. Did you get through everything you wanted to get through?